and friends in nearby villages. The peasants have lost the land, but they are not resigned to their defeat. They are bitter, not only about their treatment by the landowners, that they might have expected, but they feel especially frustrated by the response of government and the military. For Bert Pelaez, the promises of President Aquino's people power government have been betrayed.
Before the election, Cory said there would be land for the landless. Now the elections are over, and here we are. We are poor people, and we got together, and we moved on to the land of a rich man that was just lying waste. But she hasn't paid any attention to us. This was her program, that all the idle land should be cultivated, and that's what we were doing. But she hasn't done anything for us. Isn't there any room for the poor in the presidential palace? Why does she talk about offering amnesty to the rebels in the mountains, when poor people like us have worked so hard, and all we're asking for is this land? Does she want us to become rebels too, before she'll listen to us? We are not rebels, but if that's what she wants, the government keeps calling us NPA and rebels. Well, maybe it would be better if we were rebels. Don't we have the right to live in our own country? If we have no right to live here, it would be better if they killed us. But let them come and face us, not do it behind our backs. We can't take the hardship and the suffering anymore. Animals are treated better. They have treated us like animals, not like human beings.
The land hunger in the Philippines is not a new problem. It is a legacy of 400 years of colonial rule, first by Spain, then by the United States. Under Spain, large areas of land were granted to the various Catholic religious orders, which became the biggest landowners. These friar lands, as they were called, were the first haciendas, vast agricultural estates with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of tenants and farm workers. This began a pattern of land monopoly that still continues today. Historian Renato Constantino.
The communities that the Spaniards encountered in the Philippines were conducting agricultural activities based on subsistence. There was no private ownership of land. Land was owned in common by the members of the barangay. Spanish colonialism introduced the concept of private property. There were the haciendas granted to religious corporations. They occupied vast agricultural lands which they managed. Many of the tenants felt exploited under the friar estates because aside from tilling the soil, they were asked to perform other services. You must remember that the friars were the real power during colonial times under the Spanish period. In the second half of the 19th century, the Philippines was linked to the world capitalist system. This period was characterized by the growth of the hacienda system. A group of Filipinos were able to amass lands in order to devote these lands to the production of export commodities like sugar, hemp, tobacco, and coconut. These lands were acquired by them either through fraudulent surveys, through certain grants. They lent money to the individual landowners who, upon failure to pay their debts, transferred the ownership of these lands to the creditors. The land use system persisted up to the days of the Revolution, and this was the kind of land system that the Americans encountered.
Filipinos rose up in arms against Spanish rule in 1896. The United States entered the conflict and offered aid to the Filipino revolutionaries. 2 years later, the Spanish garrison in Manila surrendered to American troops. However, instead of recognizing the government established by Filipinos, the American force turned its guns on the revolutionaries and began a war of conquest that was to cost 600,000 lives. The new colonizers found it prudent to preserve the haciendas and the land monopoly of the elite.
The Americans, as part of their colonial tactics, had to win the adherence and the loyalty of the big landlords. And therefore, this led to the preservation of the economic power of the landlords. Now, the Americans also knew that a great source of Filipino discontent, which led to the revolution, was the oppression and the economic exploitation of the friars. So that in 1903, Governor Taft negotiated with the Vatican to acquire the friar estates. And there were about 166,000 hectares of friar lands that were bought by the U.S. government for distribution to the Filipinos. But then the American government wanted to have its money back. And since the poor tillers could not afford the price at which the lands were being sold, these lands were bought by the landowners who could afford it. And this further boosted land monopoly during the early American period.
Among those who accumulated large landholdings during this period was the family of President Corazon Cojuangco Aquino. The president and her brothers and sisters own Hacienda Luisita, a sugar estate covering over 5,000 hectares with a labor force of thousands. When Cory Aquino ran for the presidency, she promised to meet the peasants' demand for land, and she vowed to include her own hacienda in the land reform program. In the months following the February 1986 uprising that swept Aquino to power, little was heard from the new government about agrarian reform. In January 1987, the National Peasant Organization, the KMP, mobilized peasants from all over the country to come to Manila to draw attention to the land issue. The peasant movement wanted to pressure the government to accept a sweeping program of free distribution of land to the landless. KMP Chairman Jimmy Tadeo.
We had high expectations because the president had promised to bring in real agrarian reform, and she said her own hacienda would be a model. She also said she would bring in a government of consultation, not a government of dictation. Surely that means consultation with the 70% of the Filipino people who are peasants. We called for action on a land reform program, and we waited for an answer outside the Department of Agrarian Reform. We camped there for 7 days, and there was no response whatsoever. So we decided to try for an audience with the president, to ask her to bring in legislation. But when we got there, the police and the military fired at us. 13 people died, and at least 300 were wounded. We never expected anything like this from a government that was brought in by people's power, one that was supposed to be a democracy. It took the shedding of peasants' blood before they would begin talking about agrarian reform.
On January 22nd, 1987, peasants were stopped by a phalanx of police and Marines at Mendiola, near the presidential palace. Suddenly, without any warning, the military opened fire. families of the 13 victims gather to place a memorial marker at the site of the massacre. The government's response to the incident was to bring charges of inciting to rebellion against peasant leader Jimmy Tadeo. No charges were laid against the troops who fired, and the commanding general was promoted. The victims have almost been forgotten. The tragedy did give agrarian reform a higher place on the government's agenda. 6 months later, the president issued an executive order on agrarian reform, although the specific details were left to Congress to work out. Finally, in June 1988, after a year of acrimonious debate, the president signed into law the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, known as CARP. For President Aquino, the measure fulfills her promise of land to the tillers.
Please be seated. I have just signed into law the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. This act, I hope, will end all the acrimony and misgivings of the contending parties to the program and unite the nation behind the effort to make agrarian reform a success in our country. Every side has been respectfully heard. Few measures have been as rigorously scrutinized and discussed as this program has been by representatives of the people and by the people themselves.
The new agrarian reform law is complex and contradictory. It declares that all private and public agricultural lands will be subject to land reform over a 10-year period. Privately owned lands, including the big haciendas, will be bought by the government and resold to farmer beneficiaries. The government will also offer credit and technical assistance to the new owners to develop the land. At the same time, other provisions call into question the effectiveness of the agrarian reform measure. How much land will be distributed if retention limits allow landowners to keep 5 hectares for themselves and 3 hectares for each child over 15? How much land is left for tillers when corporate farms, which include most of the big haciendas, can avoid redistribution of their land, and commercial farms producing such crops as bananas, pineapples, or shrimp are exempted for 10 years? How will poor farmers pay for the land at 6% interest over 30 years? And finally, how will the government, facing crippling debts itself, pay landowners the promised full compensation for their land? This is not the first agrarian reform law in the Philippines. There have been no fewer than 43 presidential decrees and 10 acts of Congress since the 1930s, more than any other country in Asia. None has broken the land monopoly of the landlords. The former chairman of the House Agrarian Reform Committee fears the Aquino program will perform no better than those of the past. Congressman Bonnie Gallego.
I believe it is a mockery of agrarian reform in terms of the intent and purpose of agrarian reform. There are so many loopholes that, understandably, many landlords voted for the measure because they think that it is a very innocent measure. I will not hurt them at all. These people in control of government who participate in the electoral process, being elected to public office, these are the people who hold economic power in this country. It's a very basic fact that when they get elected into office, they use the state power or political power to broaden the economic power, and then it is a vicious circle. And people keep on hoping that every election would bring a change.
That we should be cautious and circumspect in all our actions and endeavors. As I have
when you talk of retention limit, for instance, you have a retention limit of 5 hectares for the landowner. And yet they have also accepted an award ceiling per child of 3 hectares. So effectively, you might have 12 to 15 hectares as a retention limit for one landowning family. And so you already exclude about 80 to 82% of the total private agricultural land area from the application of agrarian reform.
Secretary Philip Huico is the cabinet member in charge of implementing the government's agrarian reform law. He believes the program will succeed.
It is essentially a promise of land to the tiller, and the promise has been fulfilled. Now, I don't know what the basis was of my friend Bonnie Gallego's statement that 80, how many?
80%.
80% will be excluded. I don't know about that figure. I've heard it, but it's one of the many figures that I hear. No, so now of course there are bound to be a number of loopholes, and we're looking at all of these things right now. And we will try to be as administratively prudent and judicious to ensure that these loopholes are not availed of. No? But we cannot attain perfection here in this world. There's bound to be some aberration along the way. So we'll just have to live with that and amend the law as we implement the program.
Land holdings registered as corporations, like the president's own Hacienda Luisita, will remain intact and will not be distributed under the law.
Because,
Professor Constantino.
while ostensibly this comprehensive agrarian reform program will cover all agricultural lands, the bill has many loopholes in favor of the land-owning class. As a matter of fact, the most glaring example is Hacienda Luisita of President Aquino. It is classified as a corporate farm and therefore need not be distributed to the tenants. All they have to do is to set aside 3% of the gross earnings and maybe later on give the tenants some shares of stock. Now, you know very well in corporations you can distribute the shares of stock, but the controlling hand will still be the owners of the block of shares, which would be in the Cojuangco family. And there are similar other corporate farms.
For the peasants of Mindoro who occupied the Aquafil estate, the agrarian law offers no hope. Peasants who occupy land without permission forfeit the right to acquire land under the program and face further penalties. In any case, since Aquafil produces prawns, the owners will argue it is a commercial farm and under the law has a 10-year exemption. The government claims its agrarian reform program will give land to the landless. But the failure of successive governments to seriously address the land problem over the years pushed frustrated peasants to revolt. Today, the persistent land hunger continues to fuel a major guerrilla insurgency that is developing its own version of agrarian reform.
Now there are 2 versions of agrarian reform in place. There is the version being implemented by the New People's Army in areas that they control and occupy or exert the more preponderant influence. They have already their own version of agrarian reform. When you have such poverty and misery, it's easy for people to become members of an organization that would promise them a better life. And it's not just a promise. They are seeing that kind of life in some areas that are occupied by the New People's Army. Because in the first place, the landlords are no longer physically present, and the land has been left to the control of the people. It's not any government agency, not social welfare, not the Department of Agriculture or Agrarian Reform, but people who are really in place. Members of the New People's Army or even perhaps cadres of the Communist Party of the Philippines.
paputyag sa ilang mga demanda.
But they are not considered as communists. They are not considered as devils. They are considered as people who are there and helping them out in their basic needs.
In the mountains of Nueva Vizcaya, the guerrilla movement has set in motion a daring program of agrarian reform. Lands belonging to the biggest landlords are being confiscated and distributed free to landless peasants. The land issue has been at the heart of the insurgency since it began 19 years ago. Today it has spread to most major islands of the archipelago. The movement is spearheaded by the NDF, the National Democratic Front, an alliance of 14 groups, including the New People's Army and the Communist Party. In this and other regions, the NDF has recently set up a provisional revolutionary government. In its first proclamation, the rebel government here launched a program of land confiscation. Generally, smaller landlords are not subject to land confiscation. Instead, the NDF helps tenants negotiate lower land rents and interest rates. But the movement has targeted the land of about 20 of the biggest landowners in the province. The list includes the provincial governor, a congressman, a general, a mayor, and a judge. In addition to their private estates, this elite controls thousands of hectares of public pasture lands, acquired through their connections with the deposed dictator Ferdinand Marcos. After Marcos, they transferred allegiance to the present government and held on to their property. At this meeting, the NDF is issuing land title certificates to 22 farmers, recognizing their right to the land. Teresa Maria Ruiz is a local leader of the NDF.
When we came to this area, we occupied it and began to work the land. But this is the first time that your ownership of it has been recognized. I know you all remember how we first set foot here in the 1970s. We came from different villages, from different provinces. Some came from Benguet, Ambaguio, Cayapa, Ifugao. We left our homes, our families, and our friends. We left our homes because there was no more land to farm, no food, and no living to be made. We chose to go in search of land in new places and to build our homes. When we came here, we found this land, pasture land that belonged to the big landlords. We needed land so desperately that we gathered our courage and decided to settle here and to begin farming. Each of us knew there was no doubt in any of our minds that if we did not find land, our families would starve to death. This is why we were able to find the courage to occupy land, even though we had no permission to do it.
Walang papel yung mga magsasaka sa pagpapatakbo ng gobyerno ni Cory Aquino.
There is no role for peasants in the government of Cory Aquino. There is no one who represents peasants. On the contrary, the people in power are the landlords and the big capitalists who control the economy. They use the government to control the laws in order to protect their own economic interests. Now that we've got to the point where we can take insurrectionary actions, like confiscating big land holdings, it is only fair we should recognize the peasants' right to this land. This is the purpose of the land titles or certificates that we in the NDF in this area are issuing. The titles show that we recognize the peasants' rights to the land that they have been tilling for a long time, or that they have confiscated from big landlords and big businessmen.
Some of the peasants were given title to recently confiscated lands. Others received certificates recognizing ownership of land they've occupied for years but did not own. Farmer Donato Gapit is one of the recipients.
For me, it's a feeling of great relief. I mean, perhaps if the government had acknowledged all the hard work we put into this land and recognized our claims, then it might have been different. But when the NDF came here, it all became much easier. We didn't have to pay for all kinds of things. And the important thing is, we got ownership certificates right away. It didn't take them long at all. And we got titles recognizing our ownership of the land. I really appreciate that.
Pukaw kan, pati siya nakutuan niya. Pukaw ka, si kapay ti pumungot, si kapay ti kwa, adauban ni Jiret.
Donato and his neighbor Miguel are settlers who came to this area a decade ago in search of land. The families are ethnic minorities, originally from the nearby Cordillera Mountains. It's a region where arable land is scarce and mining and logging interests have dispossessed many of their land. When they settled here, the families cleared plots using the traditional method of slash and burn. The steep slopes and thin soil made farming arduous and unproductive. They planted corn, sweet potatoes, and bananas on the hillside. They grew rice on terraces between the slopes. Yields are poor, but it is enough to survive. The land belonged to a Colonel Sampson from Manila. The colonel was holding the land, speculating on the discovery of gold in the area. He sent armed men to drive the settlers away. Donato describes what happened.
When the colonel's men came here, some of them were armed. Since we're all civilians, of course, we were really frightened. They threatened us with their guns. They said they would pay for the fruit trees, but they wouldn't pay for any of the other improvements we'd made to the land. We couldn't find out why. Because of the guns, I was really scared, so my family and I fled the place. I took them to Balance, where it would be safer. First, I wanted to make sure they were safe, so that nothing would happen to them. Then I wanted to come back. Well, when I got back, they were burning the houses. I soon found out that mine had been burned to the ground, along with the others.
One peasant was killed by the owner's men. Because of the danger, the families left the area, returning in 1983 to start over again. The following year, the farmers were surprised by the arrival of another armed group. It turned out to be a unit of the New People's Army. The NPA intended to establish a new guerrilla front in the province. At first, the farmers were afraid. They had heard chilling stories on the radio about the NPA.
If you don't know anything about